Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Marianne Cole. Today, we're returning to a case that has shadowed Los Angeles and true crime imagination for more than 7 decades, the murder of Elizabeth Short, known to the world as the Black Dahlia. On the morning of January 15, 1947, a young housewife named Betty Bersinger walked her 3-year-old daughter down a quiet residential street and found what she first thought was a discarded mannequin in a vacant lot on Norton Avenue. It wasn't a mannequin.
Yeah, it's one of those images that keeps people awake. The body was posed, laid on its back, arms overhead, legs apart, and horrifically bisected at the waist. Forensic notes tell us the cut was at the 2nd and 3rd lumbar vertebrae, a level of precision that suggested anatomical knowledge. There was almost no blood at the scene, which means the killing and mutilation happened somewhere else.
I remember, Leela, the first time I looked at the coroner's report. The scene description, so theatrical, in a quiet post-war neighborhood, felt like a piece of theater staged for the paperboys and neighbors. Betty thought mannequin. Other passersby called police. Within hours, reporters and photographers swarmed that lot on the 5300 block of South Norton Avenue, and the scene, already grim, was immediately compromised.
Right, Marion. The early contamination is key to understanding why this case never yielded the kind of evidence modern investigators would demand. Patrol cars, curious onlookers, photographers, footprints, and potential trace evidence were trampled. In 1947, crime scene protocol was not what it is now, and once that immediate window of control was lost, so too was the chance to collect fragile material that might have been decisive later.
Let's slow down and talk about Elizabeth Short as a person, not a headline. She was born July 29, 1924, in Boston, the third of 5 daughters, raised in Medford, Massachusetts. Her family life was complicated. Her father, Cleo Short, built miniature golf courses and failed during the Depression. His disappearance on a bridge near the family home was assumed a suicide, and Phoebe Short raised the girls alone. That instability followed Elizabeth West years later.
And her health, Marion, is often overlooked. From her teens, she suffered severe asthma and lung problems. Doctors sometimes sent her to Florida for the milder winters. She wasn't a robust party girl living a jet-set life. Friends remembered her as polite, ladylike, often reserved in close relationships, though she could be social in public and like to dream big about her future. Those small human details get erased by the myth.
Exactly. The headlines turned her into a femme fatale almost overnight, a Black Dahlia who had come to Hollywood chasing a dream. In reality, she drifted, Vallejo, Santa Barbara, Florida, working short-term jobs, mostly as a waitress, staying in cheap hotels, rooming houses with acquaintances. She wanted something better, said she wanted to be in movies, but there's no verified acting work. The aspiring actress label was mostly media construction after her death.
That myth-making is crucial to the whole story. The press had a ready narrative. A young woman, nightlife, promiscuity rumors. Those sell newspapers. But the records show she was often financially unstable, prone to embellishing her life story, and tragically vulnerable. We need to keep reminding listeners, Elizabeth was a 22-year-old with chronic illness who moved around looking for stability, not a symbol.
Let's talk about the last confirmed movements. In late December 1946, she was in San Diego staying with a family, Dorothy French and her mother, after sleeping in a movie theater, of all places. In early January 1947, a Navy man named Robert Red Manley drove down to see her. On January 8th, she left with him. They checked a suitcase at the Greyhound station, spent a night at a roadside motel, and on January 9th, he took her to the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. That Biltmore sighting is essentially the last solid public anchor.
Yes. Staff later recalled Elizabeth waiting in the Biltmore lobby that evening, pacing and nervous. Manley says he left around 6:30 p.m. and drove home to his wife. After that, her trail goes cold. There are dozens of conflicting sightings over the next 6 days, at the Cecil Hotel, in bars, with friends, but police later judged that the timeline between January 9th and the 15th is essentially unknown. That gap is what generated so many theories.
6 days. That's the phrase that keeps coming up. For 6 days, she disappears from reliable record, and then, on the morning of January 15th, her body appears in a vacant lot, staged. It's the missing week that fuels every hypothesis. Was she held captive? Was she drifting and finally crossed paths with the killer? Or, horrifyingly, was she in the killer's control that entire time?
All plausible, and all impossible to prove with confidence now. The autopsy put time of death roughly around 10 hours before discovery, so late on January 14th into the early hours of the 15th might fit. But that tells us nothing of the preceding days. We see a crime that likely occurred elsewhere, then a body cleaned and staged in daylight. Someone prepared that display.
Let's walk listeners through the discovery itself. Betty Bersinger was walking to a shoe repair shop with her young daughter. She saw what she thought was a mannequin. She stepped closer and realized it was a human body, nude and bisected. She ran to a nearby house to call police. Later, she told interviewers she had initially thought mannequin, but photographs show the body's condition. Memory and shock, it's complicated.
Complicated is right. The patrol officers arrived, then homicide, then photographers. Within minutes, the scene was layered with people and impressions. That lack of perimeter control is repeatedly cited in later detective memos as a catastrophic early failure. When you destroy the context in the first hour, you lose the thread you might have pulled later with better science.
The coroner's report is clinically precise. Cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage from blows to the head. There were lacerations and trauma to face and head, and the mutilations are largely post-mortem. The bisection, hemicorporectomy at the lumbar spine, was clean and controlled, pointing to anatomical knowledge or surgical experience. That's the detail that turned the case from a local horror into something almost surgical and uncanny.
And I want to emphasize something here. Hemicorporectomy is not a term reporters in 1947 bandied about casually. It's a drastic, rare procedure. For the cut to be clean through bone and spinal elements suggests someone who either had surgical training or had studied anatomy carefully. That detail shaped suspect lists and later theories, and it's what made physicians like George Hodel come under suspicion.
We should also address the grotesque. Rope marks on wrists, ankles, and neck. Cuts from the corners of the mouth toward the ears that some described as a Glasgow smile. Sections of flesh removed. Newspapers amplified or invented details, cigarette burns, forced consumption of excrement, that the official autopsy didn't support. The sensational reporting blurred truth and fiction almost immediately.
Exactly. Police later admitted sometimes letting false stories circulate purposely to flush out false confessors or to protect specific details of the crime. That tactic may have offered short-term investigative benefits, but in the long run, it poisoned the public record. Witnesses and hoaxers picked up those invented details, and memory contamination became systemic.
One of the strangest threads came a week after discovery, a phone call to the Los Angeles Examiner from someone claiming to be the killer. Then a manila envelope arrived with Elizabeth's birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and an address book embossed with the name Mark Hansen. The items had been wiped with gasoline to remove fingerprints. That package, many believe, came from the killer. A chilling act of control and showmanship.
That package does change the dynamic. If genuine, it suggests a killer who wanted attention and to lead the press. The so-called Black Dahlia Avenger letters and the taunting tone in subsequent notes pushed the narrative into the public theater of crime. But of course, newspapers also courted this attention. There's mutual exploitation here, which only muddied police leads.
There were hundreds of suspects and many false confessions. Initially, the LAPD looked at over 150 suspects. 60 gave confessions early on. Over the years, more than 500 people claimed responsibility. Most were mentally ill, grandstanding, or simply seeking notoriety. Detectives were overwhelmed. They were chasing hundreds of shadows.
And the department itself was under strain. Post-war growth, vice graft, corruption in certain units. Investigation resources were stretched thin, and the case was politicized in ways that hampered steady follow-up. Evidence was misfiled or lost, scenes contaminated, leads chased in fits and starts. It's not that no one tried, it's that the system failed at many points simultaneously.
Lila, I want to talk suspects, starting with Dr. George Hill Hodel. He was a Los Angeles physician, trained as a gynecologist, moving in high circles. LAPD made him a prime suspect briefly in 1949. The bugging tapes from his Franklin house allegedly included lines like, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia," which is chilling. Later, his son Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective, argued his father was the killer. What's your take on what made Hodel plausible and why it remains unproven?
George Hodel checks several boxes that researchers find provocative: medical training consistent with the surgical bisection, social proximity to Hollywood, and odd behaviors on recorded conversations. Steve Hodel's work added family photographs he believes show Elizabeth, geographic proximity, and circumstantial links like matching cement brands found near the dump site. But plausible and provable are different. There's no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, tying George Hodel definitively to the crime, and many alleged photographic matches are disputed by experts.
So he fits a narrative, but lacks the evidentiary chain a prosecutor would need. Leslie Dillon is another name that comes up, a bellhop and former mortician's assistant. He wrote to a police psychologist and became entangled in the investigation. Pugh Eatwell later argued in her book that Dillon and associates ran a hotel scheme and that Elizabeth might have been killed because she knew too much. But Dillon was cleared. What happened there?
Dillon's case is messy. He exhibited a fixation on the crime and had background that could plausibly put him close to knowledge of anatomy. He had connections to Mark Hansen and others in Elizabeth's orbit. But the district attorney's files placed him in San Francisco around the time of the murder, and the LAPD officially cleared him after extensive interrogation. There are modern authors who re-examine Dillon as the prime suspect, and some feel he was scapegoated or mishandled, but again, no conclusive proof linking him to the scene.
Mark Hansen's name showing up on the address book in the mailed package made him attractive to the press as well. He was a nightclub owner who'd had Elizabeth briefly stay at his place. Some accounts suggested he made advances she rebuffed, yet he had alibis. The address book may simply have been something Elizabeth used, not a clue to guilt, right?
Right. Hansen is an example of how proximity and social ties create suspicion in a media storm. He owned clubs, employed young women, and his name on a book in Elizabeth's things invites speculation. But a solid alibi and lack of physical evidence make it impossible to move beyond suspicion. And in many of these cases, the press treats association like proof, which it is not.
We should also mention Robert Red Manley, the last known man to have been with Elizabeth on January 9th. He was thoroughly polygraphed and interviewed. He had a wife and said he left her at the Biltmore Hotel and drove home. He was cleared when his alibi checked out. Still, being the last confirmed sighting makes him a focus in many retellings.
Which points back to that missing week. Being the last to see her doesn't equal guilt, unless other evidence supports it. Manley cooperated, and investigators found no physical tie to the murder. He's an example of how sensible, verifiable alibis should matter, even when public pressure wants a villain quickly.
Let's step back to the crime scene choices. The staging, the washing of the body, the daylight dump. Why do you think the killer would go to such lengths to pose the body just inches from the sidewalk in a quiet neighborhood?
There are a few possibilities. One is practical. Washing the body and moving it to a visible lot removed forensic evidence,
blood, fibers, and trace materials, thus making identification of the actual murder site harder. Another is symbolic. The posture and placement suggest the killer wanted the body found, perhaps to shock or to claim notoriety. The package sent to newspapers supports the idea someone wanted control over the narrative. It's also possible the staging was meant to degrade or punish Elizabeth specifically, but motives intermingle and remain speculative.
The mannequin impression is chilling. The idea that the body was posed like an object, drained of blood, pale and waxen. It's the line between dehumanization and a message. The press loved that image, and here again, media behavior mattered, not just reporting what happened, but shaping what happened next by sensationalizing it.
Which leads into one of the most damaging cycles. As the press invented or exaggerated details, hoaxes proliferated, and desperate or sick individuals sent confessions. Detectives chased those. Meanwhile, investigative resources were diverted and memories contaminated. The department's occasional use of misinformation tactics, letting false rumors circulate to separate true from false confessors, was short-term pragmatism with long-term costs.
So much of the case's collapse rests on institutional choices and limitations of the era. Forensics in 1947 couldn't do DNA. Blood typing and trace analysis were primitive by modern standards. Record keeping was inconsistent, and over time, some materials were lost or destroyed. That's a technical reason the case still resists closure.
And there's a social reason, too. Post-war Los Angeles was booming. Population pressure, stretched policing, organized vice, and Elizabeth Short was an easy tabloid subject. Young, single, drifting, and therefore, in the system's eyes, expendable. The city's politics and corruption in some quarters probably made a thorough, unhurried investigation more difficult than it needed to be.
Let's name a few of the more fringe connections that keep resurfacing. The Cleveland torso murders are cited for thematic similarity, dismemberment, and dumping, but no concrete link exists. Then there are claims like Janice Knowlton's that her father was the killer, claims that family and investigators found inconsistent. And more recently, amateur sleuth theories like Alex Baber's Zodiac connection resurfaced in 2025, tying Marvin Margolis to both sets of crimes. Intriguing, but not endorsed by law enforcement. These recurrent theories show how people keep trying to knit a single explanation out of scattered pieces.
They do, and we need to caution listeners. Pattern seeking is human, but without testable evidence, these links remain speculative. The Cleveland torso parallel is compelling thematically and sounds haunting, but thematic resemblance is not proof of the same offender. Similarly, recent claims about crossover with the Zodiac or other suspects generate headlines, yet official closure requires evidentiary support we don't have.
Lila, what are the core unanswered forensic questions that still haunt investigators? Where was Elizabeth killed? Why such precise mutilation? Why drain and wash the body? Why dump it in a visible residential lot? These are the questions that keep us returning to the file.
Those are the right questions. Each one slices at motive, skill, and opportunity. The precise mutilation demands either surgical skill or meticulous study. The washing suggests an attempt to remove trace evidence or to present a specific image. Dumping in daylight in a residential area suggests either audacity, a desire to be found, or a miscalculation. And without a confirmed murder location, investigators can't reconstruct movements or find corroborative physical evidence.
We also have to talk about the cultural mirror this case became. The Black Dahlia is a shorthand for noir Los Angeles, glamour, corruption, and a city that chews up dreams. But that shorthand erased a young woman who wrote letters to her mother, who suffered asthma, who wanted stability. Turning Elizabeth into an icon robbed her of personhood, even as it ensured the case would never be forgotten.
It's a painful paradox. The notoriety kept the case in public memory, books, TV, and movies, but it also flattened Elizabeth into a symbol. That made compassionate inquiry harder and sensational retelling easier. Our job as historians and journalists is to restore some of that personhood while acknowledging the destructive role the media played.
In the decades since, detectives and writers like Steve Hodel, Pugh Eatwell, and Eli Frankel have revisited the file, each offering new angles. Some officials have said that if Hodel were alive when new circumstantial evidence emerged, they might have pursued him more aggressively. But the thing that most authors and retired detectives agree on is the same. We need preserved, testable evidence. There isn't enough of that left.
And that's why, Marian, the case remains unsolved. It's not because no one cared. Many people, both inside and outside law enforcement, cared deeply and worked it hard. It's because too many critical opportunities were lost early. Scene contamination, loss of primary context, imprecise record-keeping, and the limitations of mid-century forensics. Those structural failures compounded until there was no clear way to prove a single accused person guilty in court.
There's a line in the records that's haunted me. Police use the press as a tool, and the press use the corpse as a tool. That reciprocal exploitation created a mythology that's hard to disentangle from the facts. We have to be careful when reading later confessions or modern theories. Sometimes the narrative fills the gaps rather than the evidence.
That caution matters. For listeners who are fascinated by finality, the Black Dahlia resists that neat ending. Every new book or theory is an attempt to close a wound with narrative stitches. Some come closer than others, but without preserved forensic proof, biological material, uncontaminated trace evidence, those stitches won't hold under legal scrutiny.
So where does that leave us? The unanswered questions remain. Where was she killed? Who had the skill and motive? Why the staging? Why the daylight dump? And what truly happened in those missing days from January 9th to 15th? We can map possibilities, evaluate suspects, and critique police conduct, but the central act remains unproven.
And apart from the forensics is the moral question. What did the system owe Elizabeth Short in life, and what has it owed, or failed to owe, her memory? The sensational coverage added insult to injury. Restoring her story requires attention to those small human facts: her family, her illness, her dreams. That's part of why we keep revisiting this case on Still Unanswered.
By the way, Lila, what's one thing you think the public misreads most about the case?
That people interpret the drip of new theories as evidence that the truth must be close. In reality, new theories often reflect fresh pattern seeking, rather than new, independent, testable proof. The myth grows, not the evidence. So be skeptical about the breakthrough headlines.
Yeah, amen to that. I get emails all the time from listeners convinced they found the one missing piece. Most of them are fascinating, some are even plausible, but none have changed the legal file. Still, the human impulse to try and assemble the lost week is understandable. We want justice. We want answers.
We do, and there's a value in that impulse, even if it never yields a conviction. Remembering Elizabeth as a person, keeping questions alive, and holding institutions accountable for past failures are meaningful acts in themselves. They matter to how we treat victims now and in the future.
We'll leave listeners with a few final thoughts. 1. Elizabeth Short was a real woman, not a symbol. 2. The crime itself suggests anatomical skill and deliberate staging that point to a killer who wanted attention or control, or both. 3. Investigative failures, media sensationalism, and the limitations of the era turned a solvable act into a perennial mystery. And 4. The case remains unsolved because the evidentiary thread was broken early and never recovered.
And one last thing. Modern cold case work depends on preserved evidence, biological samples, properly archived materials, uncontaminated exhibits. The Black Dahlia reminds us how critical early scene control and documentation are.
Every time we read this file, we should be learning lessons about how to prevent similar failures going forward.
That's a good note to end on. If you want to read more, I'll link show notes to sources like the Wikipedia summary, FBI archive entries, Steve Hodell's work, Pew Eatwell's research, and Eli Frankel's recent book excerpt. We'll also include coverage about recent amateur theories, so listeners can see how the story keeps evolving. But remember what Leela said. Evaluate claims by what they can prove, not how neatly they fit the myth.
And after the credits, I'll add a small note. When you read the old newspaper headlines, imagine the real woman behind the banner. Someone who wrote home, who suffered asthma, who moved chasing a life. That human picture is the corrective we should always practice.
Thank you, Lila. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Still Unanswered. If you're studying this case or have leads, of course reach out. But remember to be rigorous and compassionate. There's a family in every file.
Thank you, Marian. It's been important to revisit this carefully. And to listeners, keep your curiosity tethered to evidence. It's the only way forward.
That's it for this episode. I'm Marian Cole. This has been Still Unanswered. We'll be back with more cases where the evidence exists and the answers don't. Until then, take care.